Sometimes a man's heart knows what's right before his mind catches up. In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, 3 mountain lions sat trapped in iron cages at the auction, their golden eyes holding a wildness that refused to break. The crowd gathered, like vultures eager for blood sport or bounty money. When the auctioneer raised his hammer, folks expected the usual bidders, ranchers wanting target practice or shows seeking attractions. When a weathered cowboy stepped forward, cutting through noise with words that would change everything, nobody saw coming. What drives a man to risk everything for creatures considered enemies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This tale of courage will challenge everything you think you know about what it means to be truly free. Samuel Garrett had learned to read the morning sky like most men read newspapers. Standing on his porch with coffee steaming in his hands, he watched the sun paint the mountains gold while his cattle grazed in the distance. At 63, Sam carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who'd seen enough of life to understand its weight. The leather journal in his shirt pocket held 30 years of observations, weather patterns, animal movements, the subtle rhythms that govern this high country of Colorado. Mary had given him the journal the year they married, suggesting he record what mattered. "You see things others miss," she'd said, her fingers tracing the worn cover. Someone should remember. Mary had been gone 8 years now, claimed by a fever that struck swift and merciless. But her wisdom lived in every page of that journal, in every entry about the hawks that nested near Willow Creek, or the deer trails that shifted with the seasons. She taught him that watching wasn't the same as seeing, that the land spoke to those who learned its language. Sam's ranch sprawled across 500 acres of prime grazing land, nestled where the foothills met the valley floor. He'd built it with his own hands after his cavalry days ended, choosing this spot because it offered shelter from the worst weather while keeping him close to the wild places. The mountains called to something in his blood, perhaps the Cherokee heritage his grandmother had whispered about, or simply the understanding that some men belonged in open spaces. The house itself reflected Sam's practical nature: solid timber, construction, wide porches to catch the evening breeze, and windows positioned to watch the sunrise and sunset. Mary's flower garden still bloomed beside the kitchen door, though Sam tended it now with clumsy devotion. She'd planted wildflowers, mixed with herbs, creating a riot of color that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. "Wild things need sanctuary too," she'd explained when neighbors questioned her unconventional garden. His morning routine had remained unchanged for years. Coffee first, always black and strong enough to raise the dead. Then a walk to check the cattle, noting which animals seemed restless or healthy, watching for signs of predators or illness. Sam believed in prevention over cure, in reading the small signals before they became large problems. The barn held his most treasured possessions: his late father's cavalry saddle, worn smooth by years of hard riding, tools maintained with military precision, and shelves lined with Mary's herb collection. She'd been a natural healer, combining book learning with intuition to tend both animals and neighbors. Her remedies still filled glass jars labeled in her careful script. Sam couldn't bring himself to discard them, though he'd learned to use many himself. Tom Bradley often stopped by for coffee and conversation, the deputy marshal finding solace in Sam's steady presence. Tom was younger by 15 years, but carried himself like an older man, burdened by the responsibility of keeping peace in a territory where violence simmered beneath polite society. He'd grown up in Cedar Ridge, watched it transform from a quiet ranching community to something harder, more suspicious of anything different. "Town's changing, Sam," Tom would say, settling into the porch chair Mary had claimed as her own. More folks moving in with different ideas about how things should be. Some good, some not so much. Cedar Ridge sat 20 miles south, connected to Sam's ranch by a wagon road that wound through pines and aspens. The town had grown around the railroad depot, attracting merchants, farmers, and the occasional fortune seeker. Most residents were decent people trying to build something lasting, but prosperity had also drawn harder elements, men who saw opportunity in every conflict, profit in every problem. Hiram Walsh ran the auction house with theatrical flair that masked a shrewd business mind. He'd arrived from Denver 5 years earlier, claiming experience in livestock and equipment sales. His auctions drew crowds from 3 counties, creating a social event that combined commerce with entertainment. Hiram understood that people paid more when they felt excited, so he crafted each sale like a performance. The relationship between town and ranch remained generally cordial, though tensions occasionally surfaced. Some newcomers questioned Sam's methods, particularly his tolerance for predators. Most ranchers shot wolves and mountain lions on sight, viewing them as threats to livestock and profit. Sam took a different approach, using his knowledge of animal behavior to minimize conflicts without resorting to violence. He'd learned this philosophy during his cavalry years, scouting for the army through territories where survival depended on understanding rather than destroying. The best scouts knew how to read sign, how to move through dangerous country without starting unnecessary fights. Animals operated by predictable patterns: hunger, territory, protection of young, and respecting those patterns often prevented conflict. Mary had reinforced this understanding through her own observations. She'd grown up on a farm where her father shot everything that moved, creating a barren landscape devoid of natural balance. "Killing everything you fear just creates more things to fear," she'd observed. "The land knows how to heal itself if we let it." Their marriage had been a partnership built on shared respect for the natural world. Mary brought book learning and healing knowledge, while Sam contributed practical experience and protective instincts. They'd planned to raise children in this sanctuary, to pass on their accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with the land. That dream died with Mary, leaving Sam to carry their shared vision alone. The neighbors closest to Sam's spread were the Morrison family, good people who worked hard and minded their own business. John Morrison ran cattle on the adjoining section, while his wife Helen taught their 3 children and any other youngsters whose parents wanted proper schooling. The Morrisons understood Sam's methods because they'd seen the results. His livestock thrived, his land remained healthy, and predator problems stayed minimal. Other ranchers proved less understanding. Bill Hawthorne controlled the largest spread in the county, employing 30 men and running thousands of head of cattle. Hawthorne viewed the territory through the lens of conquest. Land existed to be dominated. Animals existed to serve human purposes, and anything interfering with profit deserved elimination. He'd made his opinions about Sam's approach clear during town meetings and social gatherings. "Garrett's got bleeding heart notions," Hawthorne would declare, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and influence. "This is cattle country, not some nature preserve. We can't afford sentiment when our livelihoods are at stake." Sam rarely responded to such criticism directly, understanding that argument seldom changed minds. He preferred to let his results speak for themselves. His ranch remained profitable without the constant warfare that characterized other operations. His cattle stayed healthy, his grass remained strong, and the land itself seemed to cooperate with his gentle approach. The balance had held for decades, but Sam sensed changes approaching like weather on the horizon. New attitudes, new pressures, new people who viewed the territory differently. The journal in his pocket documented these subtle shifts: increased hunting pressure in the mountains, changes in wildlife patterns, growing tension between different philosophies of land use. Standing on his porch that morning, Sam couldn't know that events were already in motion that would test everything he believed. Somewhere in the mountains, 3 mountain lions had been driven from their territory by circumstances beyond their control. Their story would soon intersect with his in ways that would challenge not just his beliefs, but his willingness to act on them. The coffee had grown cold in his hands as Sam studied the distant peaks. Mary's journal rested against his heart, filled with observations about the delicate relationships that made this harsh land livable. Soon, he would need to draw on everything those pages contained, everything Mary had taught him about courage and compassion. The morning was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly deceptive. By evening, Sam's world would begin to shift in ways that would demand he choose between comfort and conscience, between safety and the principles that defined him. The rider appeared. Through the morning haze like a bad omen, slumped forward in his saddle with dried blood staining his sleeve. Sam recognized Jake Collins before the man reached the porch, a trapper who worked the high country, usually steady as granite but now shaking like autumn leaves. "Mr. Garrett," Jake called, his voice cracked with exhaustion and something deeper. "Need to water my horse if you don't mind. Been riding since before dawn." Sam set down his coffee and stepped off the porch. Jake's horse stood with its head low, sides heaving from hard travel. The animal's condition told Sam more than words could about the urgency that had driven them from the mountains in darkness. "Water's in the trough by the barn," Sam said, studying Jake's pale face. "You look like you could use some coffee and tending yourself." Jake dismounted with careful movements, favoring his left arm. The blood on his sleeve had soaked through from a wound that needed proper attention. He led his horse to the water, then followed Sam toward the house with the hesitant steps of a man carrying heavy news. "Appreciate the kindness," Jake said, settling into the chair Tom Bradley usually occupied. "Got myself in a mess up in Devil's Canyon yesterday. Barely made it out with my hide intact." Sam poured coffee and retrieved Mary's medicine kit from the kitchen, noting how Jake's hands trembled as he accepted the cup. The trapper was known for his steady nerves. Whatever had happened in the mountains had shaken him thoroughly. "Let me tend that arm while you tell me about it," Sam said, opening the familiar leather case that held Mary's healing supplies. The sight of her careful organization still brought comfort, her wisdom preserved in labeled bottles and rolled bandages. Jake rolled up his sleeve, revealing 3 parallel gashes that had bled freely but weren't deep enough to be fatal. Sam had seen similar wounds before, claw marks from a large cat, precise and clean. He began cleaning the injuries with Mary's herbal solution, noting how Jake flinched but didn't pull away. "Wasn't hunting them," Jake said, as if reading Sam's thoughts. "Was checking trap lines up near Bear Creek when I heard the commotion. Sounded like half the territory was shooting at something. Found tracks first. 3 cats, maybe a mother with near-grown cubs. Big tracks, Sam. Real big." Sam continued his careful work, applying Mary's healing salve while Jake's story unfolded. The trapper described following the sound of gunfire and dogs, finding a scene that turned his stomach. 20 men with ropes and nets, driving 3 mountain lions toward a box canyon where escape became impossible. They weren't hunting for meat or protection. Jake continued, his voice growing hard. Had capture nets, iron cages already built. This was planned, Sam. Organized like a military operation. The implications settled over Sam like cold mountain air. Capturing mountain lions alive required extensive preparation and considerable expense. Someone had invested significant resources in taking these animals, which meant they had specific plans for them. Plans that likely meant suffering and death. "Who was leading this operation?" Sam asked, securing the bandage around Jake's arm with gentle efficiency. "Bill Hawthorne's foreman, that hard case Murphy," Jake replied. But Hawthorne himself was there, directing things from horseback like some general commanding troops. Had men positioned at every escape route, dogs to flush them from cover, nets, strong enough to hold them. Sam felt something cold settle in his chest. Hawthorne's involvement explained the scope and organization of the capture. The cattle baron had resources to mount such an operation and reasons to want predators removed from his territory. But taking them alive suggested purposes beyond simple elimination. "Where are the cats now?" Sam asked, though part of him dreaded. "The answer. That's the worst part," Jake said, meeting Sam's eyes with visible effort. loaded them in those iron cages, hauled them to town. Word is Hiram Walsh is running a special auction tomorrow, selling them to whoever pays the highest price. The coffee in Sam's stomach turned bitter. He'd attended enough of Walsh's auctions to understand how they operated. The auctioneer would play up the excitement, encourage competitive bidding, create a spectacle that brought in buyers from distant counties. 3 live mountain lions would draw attention from circuses, traveling shows, private collectors, and worse, men who paid for the privilege of killing dangerous animals in controlled conditions. "How badly injured are they?" Sam asked, already knowing the answer would increase his growing sense of urgency. "Mother cat took a bullet in the shoulder. Nothing fatal, but she's hurting. The young ones are scared but healthy. All 3 of them, packed into cages barely big enough to hold them, just sitting there with those golden eyes, watching everything but not making a sound." Sam closed the medicine kit with hands that had begun to shake slightly. Mary's voice echoed in his memory, speaking about the sanctuary she'd created in her garden. "Wild things need protection too," she'd said. These mountain lions represented everything she'd believed about the dignity of untamed life. "What kind of men were bidding?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Haven't started yet, but Walsh was taking names yesterday evening. Heard tell of a circus man from Denver, couple of trophy hunters from back east, even some fool talking about a private collection where rich folks pay to hunt in enclosed spaces." Jake's voice carried disgust that matched Sam's growing anger. The morning that had begun with peaceful beauty now felt poisoned by human cruelty. Sam understood the practical realities of ranching. Sometimes predators had to be controlled to protect livestock, but what Jake described went beyond practical necessity into the realm of entertainment and profit built on suffering. "There's more," Jake continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Heard Murphy talking to Walsh about advertising this as the first of regular auctions. They're planning to make this a business, Sam, capturing wild animals for sale to whoever pays the price." The full scope of Hawthorne's plan became clear. Using his resources and influence, the cattle baron intended to create a new source of revenue by turning the territory's wildlife into commodities. The 3 mountain lions represented a test case. If the auction proved profitable, similar captures would follow until the mountains were stripped of their most magnificent predators. Sam stood and walked to the window, looking toward the distant peaks where the cats had been born free. Mary's journal pressed against his chest, heavy with observations about the delicate balance that kept this land healthy. She documented how predators controlled rodent populations, how their presence maintained the complex relationships that prevented overgrazing and disease. "I appreciate you telling me, Jake," Sam said finally. "Takes courage to carry news like this." "Figured you should know," Jake replied, standing carefully and testing his bandaged arm. "Know you got different ideas about these things than most folks. Seemed wrong to let it happen without somebody understanding what it really means." After Jake departed for town to have his wound properly examined by the doctor, Sam remained on his porch, struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his usual calm. The 3 mountain lions faced a fate worse than quick death. They would become objects of entertainment, their wildness violated for human amusement. He thought of Mary's gentle hands tending injured birds, her tears when winter claimed the weak and vulnerable. She'd understood that protecting the defenseless required more than sympathy. It demanded action, even when that action came with personal cost. The auction would take place tomorrow at noon, leaving little time for planning or preparation. Sam had no clear idea how he might intervene, no strategy beyond the growing certainty that he could not stand by while such cruelty unfolded. The weight of decisions settled on his shoulders like a heavy pack, familiar from his cavalry days when choosing between safety and duty. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze, Sam began to understand that his peaceful life was about to change forever. The captured mountain lions had become a test of everything he claimed to believe, everything Mary had taught him about courage and compassion. Tomorrow, he would learn whether those beliefs were strong enough to risk everything he'd built in. Defensive creatures that could never thank him for his sacrifice. Sam spent the rest of the morning pacing his property like a caged animal himself, the irony not lost on him. Every familiar corner of his ranch seemed different now, viewed through the lens of Jake's terrible news. The peaceful meadow where his cattle grazed reminded him of the freedom those mountain lions would never know again. The sight of his barn, with its carefully maintained tools and organized supplies, made him think of the iron cages that now held creatures meant to roam free. By noon, he'd convinced himself a dozen times to stay out of the situation. The rational arguments lined up like soldiers in formation. He was one man against an entire system. He had no legal standing to interfere with a legitimate auction. His intervention would likely accomplish nothing except his own financial ruin. These were reasonable thoughts from a practical mind that had survived 63 years by choosing battles carefully. But then he'd catch sight of Mary's flower garden, still blooming in defiant colors beside the kitchen door, and the rational arguments would crumble like autumn leaves. She'd never tolerated cruelty in any form, whether directed at injured sparrows or mistreated horses. Her gentle strength had been legendary in these parts. Neighbors still spoke of how she'd faced down Bill Hawthorne himself when he'd tried to poison a family of foxes that had taken residence near her herb garden. "Every living thing has a right to dignity," she'd told Hawthorne that day, her voice quiet but carrying the force of absolute conviction. "Even the ones that inconvenience us." Sam found himself touching the simple gold band on his left hand, a habit he'd developed whenever Mary's memory pressed particularly close. She'd insisted on plain gold rings for their wedding, rejecting the ornate designs the jeweler had recommended. "Fancy decoration doesn't make love stronger," she'd said with her characteristic smile. "Simple truth lasts longer than elaborate promises." The ring had loosened over the years as his hands grew more weathered, but he'd never considered removing it. Sometimes he caught himself twisting it when deep in thought, finding comfort in its familiar weight. Now, as he struggled with the impossible choice facing him, the ring seemed to pulse with Mary's presence, reminding him of conversations they'd shared about moral courage and the price of standing aside when wrong flourished. After a lunch he couldn't taste, Sam hitched his wagon and headed for town. He told himself he was simply gathering information, observing the situation to better understand what was happening. Perhaps seeing the cat's condition would help him devise some reasonable solution that didn't require heroic gestures or financial sacrifice. The road to Cedar Ridge had never seemed shorter. Usually Sam enjoyed the 20-mile journey, using the time to observe seasonal changes and note details for his journal. Today, the familiar landmarks rushed past in a blur of anxious anticipation. He found himself rehearsing conversations, imagining scenarios where his intervention might actually succeed. Cedar Ridge buzzed with unusual activity as Sam approached the town limits. Extra horses stood tied to hitching posts, wagons filled, streets normally quiet during midday hours, and voices carried excitement that suggested significant entertainment awaited. Word of the mountain lion auction had clearly spread beyond the immediate area, drawing crowds from surrounding counties just as Walsh had undoubtedly intended. Sam guided his wagon toward the auction house, a large wooden structure that dominated the town's commercial district. Walsh had built it to accommodate both livestock and equipment sales, with high ceilings to reduce the summer heat and wide doors for moving large animals. Today, the building seemed to throb with anticipation as men clustered in small groups, discussing the upcoming sale with animated gestures. The mountain lions' cages sat in the yard behind the auction house, positioned where potential buyers could examine the merchandise while maintaining safe distance. Sam's first glimpse of the captured cats hit him like a physical blow. Jake's description hadn't prepared him for the reality of seeing such magnificent creatures reduced to objects for sale. The mother cat dominated the center cage, her golden coat marked with dried blood from the shoulder wound Jake had mentioned. Despite her injury, she maintained the regal bearing that marked her as a queen of the mountains. Her amber eyes surveyed the gathering crowd with intelligence and unmistakable contempt, as if she understood exactly what these humans intended and refused to grant them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. The two younger cats flanked their mother in smaller cages, their movements restless but controlled. Sam judged them to be nearly full-grown, but still dependent on their mother's guidance. Their eyes held the same intelligence as hers, but also a confusion that tugged at Sam's heart. They'd been born free in the high country, learning to hunt and survive in terrain that challenged even experienced mountain men. Now they faced a future that would mock everything their instincts demanded. Magnificent specimens, aren't they? The voice belonged to a well-dressed man, with a carefully waxed mustache and the soft hands of someone who'd never performed physical labor. I represent the Denver Imperial Circus. These cats would make excellent attractions for our traveling show. Sam nodded politely but couldn't trust himself to speak. The circus man continued his sales pitch, describing how the cats would be trained to perform tricks for audiences across the Western Territories. He spoke of them as if they were elaborate machinery rather than living beings with their own nature. And needs, of course, training wild cats requires firm discipline, the man continued, apparently mistaking Sam's silence for interest. Breaking their spirit is essential for public safety. Can't have them remembering their wild instincts during performances. The casual cruelty in those words crystallized Sam's growing resolve. This man spoke of breaking spirits as if discussing the weather, reducing creatures of extraordinary beauty and power to mere entertainment. Sam's fingers found Mary's ring, twisting it slowly as he imagined her reaction to such callous indifference. Other potential buyers wandered the yard, examining the cats like livestock at a regular auction. Two men in expensive hunting gear discussed the challenge of killing such animals in controlled conditions, speculating about the thrill wealthy clients would pay to experience. A thin man with calculating eyes measured the cages, muttering about transport costs and potential profit margins. From touring exhibitions, each conversation Sam overheard deepened his understanding of what these mountain lions faced. Whether sold to circuses, private collectors, or hunting preserves, their future held only varieties of captivity and degradation. The wild freedom they'd been born to enjoy would become a memory, then disappear entirely as captivity wore away. Their natural instincts, standing in that yard, surrounded by men who viewed magnificent predators as mere commodities, Sam felt something shift deep in his chest. Mary's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, reminding him of conversations about courage and conviction. Her ring caught the afternoon sunlight, throwing tiny reflections that danced like sparks of conscience. The auction wouldn't begin for another hour, but Sam had seen enough to understand the choice before him. He could return to his ranch, preserve his comfortable life, and live with the knowledge that he'd stood aside while creatures deserving protection were sold into suffering. Or he could step forward, risk everything he'd built, and attempt what rational thought declared impossible. The mountain lions watched him through the iron bars of their cages, their golden eyes holding no expectation of rescue. They'd already learned that humans brought only pain and captivity. But in their proud bearing, Sam recognized something that spoke to his deepest beliefs about dignity and freedom. Mary's ring seemed to grow warmer on his finger as he made his decision. The auction house filled beyond capacity as noon approached, men crowding every available space with the eager anticipation of spectators at a prize fight. Hiram Walsh had outdone himself with the promotion, transforming what should have been a routine livestock sale into the social event of the season. His voice carried over the crowd as he tested his microphone, promising entertainment that would be discussed for years to come. Sam found a position near the back wall where he could observe without drawing attention. The faces around him reflected excitement, greed, and casual cruelty that made his stomach turn. These weren't necessarily evil men, but their indifference to the mountain lion's suffering revealed something deeply troubling about human nature when mob psychology took hold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh began, his theatrical voice filling the auction house, "today we offer something truly extraordinary. 3 magnificent mountain lions, captured alive after terrorizing local ranchers for months. These are not ordinary predators. These are the kings and queen of the high country, brought low by human courage and ingenuity." The crowd erupted in applause and whistles, treating the captured cats like trophies already won. Sam noticed how Walsh skillfully played up the danger the animals had supposedly posed, creating a narrative that justified their capture while enhancing their value as exotic merchandise. "Bidding will begin at $50 for the trio," Walsh announced, his hammer poised dramatically above the podium. "These cats represent a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the right buyer. Imagine the crowds they'll draw, the excitement they'll generate, the profits they'll provide for decades to come." The Denver circus representative raised his hand immediately, opening the bidding with confident authority. His competitors followed quickly, the hunting preserve owner from Kansas, the private collector from San Francisco, each bid driving the price higher, while the mountain lion's fate grew more certain. Sam watched the numbers climb past $100, then $150, representing more money than most local families saw in a year. The bidders showed no concern for such amounts, treating the escalating price as merely another form of entertainment. Their casual wealth highlighted the vast difference between their world and that of the working ranchers who actually lived. With predator challenges, $200, called the hunting preserve owner, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through financial superiority. "These cats will provide sport for my most distinguished clients." The circus man countered immediately, raising his bid to $225. The crowd grew more excited as the competition intensified, feeding off the tension between buyers who clearly viewed this as a personal contest as much as a business transaction. Sam's hands trembled as he calculated the mathematics of intervention. His entire savings account contained less than $400, accumulated through years of careful management and modest living. Mary's medical bills had depleted their reserves, leaving him with enough to maintain his ranch, but little buffer for emergencies or grand gestures. The bidding continued its relentless climb toward $300, each increase driving the possibility of successful intervention further beyond Sam's reach. He touched Mary's ring again, feeling the warm metal against his weathered skin, remembering her voice during their discussions about moral courage versus practical wisdom. "Sometimes doing right costs more than doing wrong," she'd said during one of their evening conversations on the porch. "That's what makes it a real choice, instead of just convenient sentiment." At $325, the private collector dropped out with a disgusted shake of his head. The circus representative and hunting preserve owner faced each other across the auction house like gunfighters at high noon, each waiting for the other to flinch first. $350, the hunting preserve owner declared, his voice carrying finality that suggested he'd reached his limit. "Dekicho." Circus man hesitated for the first time, calculating profit margins against purchase price with visible concentration. The pause stretched long enough for the crowd to sense uncertainty, their excited murmur reflecting anticipation of a conclusion. Walsh raised his hammer, beginning the traditional countdown. $350 going once. Sam stepped forward before conscious thought could stop him, his voice cutting through the auction house noise like a knife through silk. $400. The silence that followed was so complete Sam could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Every face in the building turned toward him with expressions ranging from shock to outrage, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly begun speaking, He saw recognition dawn in several eyes, neighbors who knew him as the quiet rancher who minded his own business and never made waves. Walsh recovered first, his showman's instincts recognizing opportunity in the unexpected development. "We have a new bidder at $400. Do I hear $425? The hunting preserve owner's face darkened with anger at this local interference in what he'd considered a private competition between serious buyers. His wealth and influence clearly hadn't prepared him for challenge from a simple rancher whose appearance suggested limited resources. $425, he snapped, glaring at Sam with open hostility. Sam felt every eye in the building focused on him, waiting to see if his dramatic intervention was genuine or merely a momentary impulse he couldn't sustain. The weight of decision pressed down like a physical burden, but Mary's memory provided strength he hadn't known he possessed. $450, Sam said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was risking. Angry mutters rippled through the crowd as neighbors began questioning his motives and sanity. Bill Hawthorne's voice rose above the general noise, demanding to know what Garrett thought he was doing, interfering with legitimate business. The social pressure was immediate and intense, designed to force Sam back into his expected role as quiet observer. The hunting preserve owner studied Sam with new calculation, perhaps recognizing something in his bearing that suggested this wasn't a bluff or momentary madness. The man had built his wealth through reading people accurately, understanding when opponents possessed genuine determination versus mere bravado. $500, he announced, throwing down what he clearly intended as a final challenge. The amount exceeded Sam's total resources by more than $100. Effectively ending his ability to continue the bidding through conventional means. He stood at the back of the auction house, feeling the weight of failure settling over him like a heavy blanket, when Tom Bradley appeared at his elbow. "I've got $50 saved," the deputy marshal whispered, pressing folded bills into Sam's hand. "Always figured you'd know the right thing to do with it when the time came." The unexpected support provided more than just additional funds. It offered validation that Sam's actions reflected shared values rather than personal delusion. If Tom Bradley, sworn to uphold law and order, was willing to support this intervention, perhaps the cause wasn't as hopeless as it appeared. Sam straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and prepared to make the bid that would either save 3 mountain lions or destroy everything he'd spent a lifetime building. $550, Sam announced, his voice carrying across the stunned auction house with surprising authority. The hunting preserve owner's confident expression cracked for the first time, replaced by something approaching respect mixed with frustration. He'd clearly expected his final bid to end the competition, not realizing he faced an opponent motivated by principle rather than profit. His hesitation stretched long enough for the crowd to sense the tide turning. Walsh seized the moment with theatrical flair, his hammer rising dramatically as he began the final countdown. $550 going once, going twice. The pause seemed to last forever, as every person in the building held their breath. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." The explosion of noise that followed mixed cheers, curses, and demands for explanation in equal measure. Sam found himself surrounded by neighbors whose expressions ranged from bewilderment to outright hostility, all wanting to understand what had driven their quiet rancher to such unprecedented action. "What in hell's name do you think you're doing, Garrett?" Bill Hawthorne's voice cut through the chaos like a bullwhip, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You just spent more money than most men see in 5 years on 3 damned cats!" Sam met Hawthorne's glare with steady calm, though his legs felt weak beneath him. The magnitude of what he'd committed to was beginning to sink in. He'd just spent virtually every dollar he possessed on creatures he had no legal means to keep and no practical way to care for. "I bought them because someone needed to," Sam replied simply, his words carrying enough quiet conviction to temporarily silence the immediate protests. Tom Bradley stepped closer, his deputy's badge catching the afternoon light as he positioned himself beside Sam, with subtle but unmistakable support. "Auction was fair and legal," he announced to the crowd. "Man's got every right to bid on whatever he chooses." The practical challenges hit Sam like a series of physical blows as he made his way toward Walsh's podium to complete the transaction. He needed to transport 3 adult mountain lions safely from town to his ranch, a distance of 20 miles, over rough terrain. His regular wagon wasn't designed for such cargo, and the cat's injured condition required careful handling that standard livestock methods couldn't provide. "Congratulations on your purchase, Mr. Garrett," Walsh said with professional politeness that couldn't quite mask his confusion. "Payment will be cash only, and you'll need to arrange transport by sundown. We can't house dangerous animals overnight in town." Sam handed over his life savings with hands that had begun to shake slightly, watching his financial security disappear in exchange for 3 certificates of ownership that felt both precious and terrifying. The mountain lions were legally his now, but ownership brought responsibilities he wasn't sure he could meet. The first problem was immediate and pressing: how to move 3 adult mountain lions 20 miles without specialized equipment or trained handlers. The cats remained in their iron capture cages, but those containers were designed for temporary containment, not safe transportation over rough roads. One overturned wagon could result in escape, injury, or death for both animals and humans. "You'll need a reinforced transport wagon," advised Doc Harrison, the town's veterinarian, who'd appeared beside Sam as the crowd began to disperse. "Those cages won't survive a 20-mile journey on your standard farm wagon. And that mother cat needs medical attention for her shoulder wound." Sam nodded gratefully, recognizing practical support when he heard it. Doc Harrison had always been a voice of reason in community discussions, someone who approached problems with scientific thinking rather than emotional reaction. "I can help with the medical care," Doc continued, "but the transport is your challenge. Hiram's got a heavy freight wagon he might rent, but you'll need to modify it for this kind of cargo." The afternoon passed in a blur of desperate improvisation as Sam worked to solve problems he'd never imagined facing. Walsh proved surprisingly helpful, perhaps motivated by professional pride in seeing the sale completed successfully. He agreed to rent his strongest freight wagon and helped Sam design modifications to secure the cages safely. The work required every practical skill Sam had developed over decades of ranch life. Using materials from the local hardware store, heavy chains, additional lumber, metal reinforcement brackets, he transformed the freight wagon into a mobile prison that could transport the mountain lions without risking escape or injury. Word of Sam's purchase spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire, drawing curious observers who treated the spectacle like a traveling circus. Children pressed against the fence surrounding the auction yard, their parents maintaining careful distance while offering commentary that ranged from admiration to harsh criticism. "Man's lost his mind," Sam heard one rancher mutter to his companion, "spending good money on predators that should have been shot in the first place. He'll be lucky if they don't kill him before he gets them home." The social pressure was immediate and intense. Neighbors who'd always treated Sam with respect now regarded him with suspicion and disappointment, as if his actions had somehow betrayed their shared understanding of proper behavior. The weight of community disapproval felt heavier than the physical labor of preparing for transport. Bill Hawthorne materialized as Sam finished reinforcing the wagon bed, his presence carrying the authority of wealth and influence that dominated local politics. His expression had moved beyond anger into something approaching paternal disappointment, as if Sam were a wayward child who required correction. "This nonsense has gone far enough, Garrett," Hawthorne declared, his voice carrying the expectation of immediate compliance. "I'll buy those cats from you at cost, save you from this foolishness before it gets worse. You can walk away from this mistake with your dignity intact." Sam paused in his work, considering the offer that would solve his immediate problems while preserving his financial security. Hawthorne's proposal was reasonable, practical, and completely contrary to everything Mary had taught him about standing by his convictions when they mattered most. "Appreciate the offer," Sam replied, returning to his work with the wagon chains. "But they're not for sale." Hawthorne's face darkened with the anger of a man unaccustomed to having his solutions rejected. "You're making enemies you can't afford, old man. This community won't tolerate disruption from someone who should know better." The threat was clear, but not unexpected. Sam had understood from the moment he placed his first bid that this action would have consequences extending far beyond the purchase price. The question wasn't whether he'd face opposition, but whether his resolve could withstand the pressure that would inevitably follow. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sam completed his preparations with the methodical care that had sustained him through previous challenges. The transport wagon stood ready, reinforced and secured for its unprecedented cargo. Doc Harrison had treated the mother cat's wound with professional skill, though she remained weak from blood loss and stress. The mountain lions themselves watched these preparations with intelligent wariness, their golden eyes tracking every movement as humans worked around their cages. They understood they were about to be moved again, but not whether this change would bring improvement or fresh suffering. Sam approached the mother cat's cage as evening light painted the mountains gold, speaking in the quiet voice he'd always used with injured animals. She studied him with those remarkable amber eyes, perhaps sensing something different in his approach compared to the rough handling she'd endured since capture. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his words carrying all the gentleness Mary had taught him to offer frightened creatures. "This part's going to be difficult, but we're heading towards something better." Whether the cat understood his words or simply recognized a change in human behavior, she allowed herself to be loaded onto the wagon without the resistance her captors had expected. Her cubs followed her example, maintaining their watchful dignity even as their world shifted once again. As Sam climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins, he felt the weight of what he'd committed to settling on his shoulders like a familiar pack. The easy part was finished. He owned 3 mountain lions, legally purchased at public auction. Now came the harder challenge of getting them safely home and deciding what to do next. The journey to Sam's ranch unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare, every rut and stone in the road threatening to overturn the precious cargo that represented both his salvation and his ruin. The mountain lions endured the transport with stoic dignity that humbled Sam, their golden eyes reflecting pain and confusion but never panic. They seemed to understand that this human was different from their captors, though they had no reason to trust any member of the species that had stolen their freedom. The mother cat's condition worried Sam most. Doc Harrison's treatment had stopped, the bleeding from her shoulder wound, but infection remained a constant threat in the days ahead. Her breathing seemed labored, her magnificent head hanging lower than pride would normally allow. The 2 cubs flanked her cage with protective instincts that spoke to bonds deeper than human understanding. Darkness had fallen by the time Sam guided the wagon through his ranch gates, the familiar outline of his house offering sanctuary that felt almost overwhelming after the day's emotional ordeal. He positioned the wagon near his barn, where the shelter would provide protection from weather and curious eyes that might still follow from town. The mountain lion's first night in captivity on his land forced Sam to confront realities he hadn't fully considered during the heat of auction fever. 3 adult predators required specialized care, secure housing, and medical attention that stretched his resources and knowledge to their limits. The iron cages that had seemed adequate for transport were barely large enough for the cats to stand and turn around, acceptable for temporary containment, but cruel for extended housing. Sam lit his lanterns and retrieved Mary's medicine kit from its place of honor in the kitchen, handling the worn leather case with reverence that bordered on worship. Inside, Her careful organization remained exactly as she'd left it. Bottles of herbal remedies labeled in her precise handwriting, bandages rolled with military precision, instruments maintained with scientific care. Mary had learned her healing. Arts from her grandmother, a woman who'd combined Cherokee wisdom with frontier practicality to treat everything from childhood fevers to mortal wounds. The knowledge had passed through generations of women who understood that healing required more than medical supplies. It demanded patience, intuition, and the ability to see beyond symptoms to underlying causes. Animals respond to intention. Mary had explained during one of her many impromptu lessons while treating injured wildlife. They sense whether you're trying to help or control. Approach with respect, and they'll usually cooperate. Approach with dominance, and they'll fight until they die. Sam carried these teachings toward the mother cat's cage, moving slowly and speaking in the quiet voice that had always calmed frightened animals. She watched his approach with wary intelligence, her injured shoulder betraying vulnerability that went against every instinct for self-protection. "Easy, girl," Sam murmured, settling onto a wooden crate positioned safely outside her reach. "I know this is frightening, but we need to tend that wound before infection sets in." The process of gaining her trust unfolded over hours rather than minutes, requiring patience that tested Sam's nerves while time worked against the cat's recovery. He began by simply sitting near her cage, speaking softly while she evaluated this new threat to her safety. Gradually, her defensive posture relaxed enough for him to observe the wound's condition more clearly. Doc Harrison's initial treatment had been skillful but necessarily hurried, focused on stopping immediate bleeding rather than comprehensive healing. The shoulder showed signs of inflammation that could develop into serious infection without proper care. Mary's herbs offered remedies that conventional medicine often overlooked, natural antiseptics and pain relievers that worked gently with the body's healing processes. The breakthrough came near midnight when exhaustion finally overcame the mother cat's vigilance. Sam had been speaking quietly about Mary, describing her garden and her way with injured creatures, when the great cat's eyes began to close. In that moment of vulnerability, she allowed him to slip a piece of meat treated with Mary's pain-relieving herbs through the cage bars. The cubs proved less suspicious of human presence, perhaps because their experience with people was limited to recent trauma rather than generations of inherited fear. They watched their mother accept Sam's offering, then cautiously approached their own portions of treated meat. The herbs would help with pain and stress while beginning the slow process of building trust between species that nature had designed as adversaries. Dawn brought new challenges that Sam had barely begun to anticipate. His two ranch hands, Pete Kowalski and young Jimmy Morrison, arrived for their daily duties to find their employer camped beside cages containing three of the most dangerous predators in North America. Their expressions progressed from confusion to alarm to barely concealed panic as the situation's implications became clear. "Mr. Garrett," Pete said carefully, his Polish accent thickening with stress, "what exactly are you planning to do with these animals?" Sam had been dreading this conversation while hoping his employees would understand the moral necessity that had driven his actions. Pete and Jimmy were good men who'd worked for him faithfully for years, but their livelihoods depended on his ranch remaining profitable and their jobs staying secure. "I'm going to nurse them back to health and find a way to return them to the wild," Sam replied with more confidence than he felt. "They don't belong in cages or circuses. They belong in the mountains where they were born." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that none of them wanted to voice directly. Keeping dangerous predators on ranch property violated numerous territorial laws, endangered neighboring livestock, and exposed everyone involved to legal and physical risks that could destroy lives and livelihoods. "Boss," Jimmy said finally, his young voice cracking with emotion, "my pa's already hearing talk in town about boycotting anyone who works for you. Says folks are calling you crazy, dangerous to the community. I got a family to think about, future plans that depend on steady work. The words hit Sam harder than physical blows, forcing him to confront consequences he'd been avoiding in his focus on the mountain lion's immediate needs. His actions wouldn't just affect his own life. They threatened the welfare of people who'd trusted him, families who depended on his ranch for their security. By noon, both ranch hands had given notice with apologies that couldn't mask their genuine regret. Pete's farewell carried special weight, given the years they'd worked together, building something substantial from raw land and ambitious dreams. "It's not that I don't respect what you're trying to do," Pete explained, his weathered hands twisting his hat brim. "But I got letter from my brother in Chicago. Says there's work in the stockyards that pays regular wages. Maybe it's time for me to try something different." The social isolation began before Sam's employees had finished packing their possessions. Mrs. Henderson at the general store informed him that his credit account was closed, pending full payment of outstanding balances. The blacksmith suddenly discovered urgent work that prevented him from shoeing Sam's horses. Even the bank president, normally cordial in their business dealings, avoided eye contact when they passed on the street. Bill Hawthorne's influence reached into every corner of the community's economic life, making Sam's continued residence increasingly untenable through methods that avoided direct confrontation. The message was clear: conform to community expectations or find yourself excluded from the social and economic networks that made ranching possible. That evening, as Sam prepared the mountain lion's second meal of herb-treated meat, he reflected on the price of moral courage Mary had always insisted came with true convictions. She'd faced similar pressure when defending unpopular causes, enduring gossip and social exclusion rather than compromise her principles. "Standing alone isn't the same as being wrong," she told him during one particularly difficult period when neighbors had criticized her treatment of injured predators. "Sometimes the hardest thing about doing right is that it has to be done without applause." The mother cat accepted her medicine with less resistance than the previous night, perhaps recognizing that this strange human's ministrations brought relief from pain rather than additional suffering. Her cubs had begun responding to Sam's voice, their wariness replaced by cautious curiosity about this creature who spoke gently and moved without threatening gestures. As Sam settled in for another night of vigilance beside the cages, he understood that the easy part of his commitment was finished. He'd purchased the mountain lions and transported them safely to his ranch, but the harder challenges lay ahead. Healing their bodies was only the beginning. He needed to prepare them for return to freedom while surviving the community pressure that threatened to destroy everything he'd built. The weight of Mary's wedding ring on his finger reminded him that some promises transcended immediate consequences, that love sometimes required sacrifice that defied practical calculation. Whether he could sustain that sacrifice long enough to complete his mission remained the question that would define the rest of his life. 3 days into his vigil with the mountain lions, Sam discovered the truth by accident, a revelation that transformed his understanding of everything that had brought these magnificent creatures to his ranch. It began with Jake Collins returning unannounced, his arm still bandaged, but his expression carrying urgency that demanded immediate attention. "Sam, we need to talk somewhere private," Jake said, glancing nervously toward the barn, where the mountain lions' cages remained hidden from casual view. "Found something in the mountains that changes everything about this situation." They walked to Sam's kitchen, where Jake spread a hand-drawn map across the scarred wooden table. The parchment looked ancient, marked with symbols and notations that spoke of secrets hidden in the high country for generations. Jake's weathered finger traced a route through terrain Sam recognized as the most remote sections of the territorial wilderness. "This belonged to my grandfather," Jake explained, his voice dropping to a whisper despite their isolation. "He was a trapper back in the 40s, knew every cave and canyon in a 100-mile radius, always claimed there were places in those Mountains where a man could hide anything and nobody would ever find it. The map detailed a network of natural caves and hidden valleys that even experienced mountain men rarely discovered. Some were marked with symbols indicating water sources, others showed seasonal game trails, but one particular notation caught Sam's attention: a cluster of caves marked with the symbol for permanent shelter, and the words, "Big enough for 20 men," written in faded ink. "What does this have to do with the mountain lions?" Sam asked, though something cold was beginning to form in his stomach as implications became clear. "I went back to Devil's Canyon yesterday, following their back trail, to see where those cats came from originally," Jake continued, his voice growing more agitated. "Found something that don't make sense unless you understand there's more to this story than anyone's been told." Jake described discovering the remains of a cattle carcass in a hidden ravine, partially consumed but showing clear signs of human manipulation. The wounds had been enlarged artificially, claw marks enhanced to suggest predator damage that exceeded what the mountain lions could have inflicted. Most telling were the drag marks leading away from the kill site, evidence that the carcass had been moved from its original location to create a deliberate trail. "Someone's been staging these attacks, Sam," Jake said, his words carrying the weight of terrible revelation. "These cats didn't wander down from the high country hunting livestock. They were driven here deliberately, forced from their territory by something that scared them more than humans." The pieces of a larger conspiracy began falling into place as Jake continued his account. The mountain lion's original territory lay in the remote canyons marked on his grandfather's map, areas that had remained undisturbed for decades because of their inaccessibility and supposed worthlessness. But recent territorial surveys had revealed something that changed their value dramatically. "There's silver in those mountains, Sam," Jake whispered, producing a small nugget that gleamed in the kitchen lamplight. "Found this in a stream near where the cats were living. If there's one, there's likely more. Enough to make men very rich and very desperate." Sam stared at the silver nugget, while his understanding of recent events underwent complete transformation. The mountain lions hadn't been captured because they threatened livestock. They'd been removed because their territory contained mineral wealth that someone wanted to claim without interference from dangerous predators or legal complications. "Bill Hawthorne's been filing mining claims throughout that area," Jake continued, consulting a second set of papers he'd obtained through contacts in the Territorial Land Office. "Started the process months ago, but regulations require proof that the land is safe for development. Can't claim it's suitable for mining operations if it's crawling with predators that threaten workers." The elegant simplicity of the conspiracy became clear as Jake laid out evidence he'd gathered through careful investigation. Hawthorne had identified the silver deposits through private surveys, then orchestrated the mountain lion's removal to eliminate obstacles to his mining claims. The staged livestock attacks provided justification for capture rather than killing, avoiding questions about why such valuable animals weren't simply shot on sight. He needed them alive for the auction, Sam realized, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Dead cats might raise questions about what drove them from their territory, but selling them publicly makes it look like a legitimate response to a genuine threat. Jake nodded grimly, spreading additional documents that detailed Hawthorne's expanding business interests. The cattle baron wasn't content with dominating the ranching industry. He was positioning himself to control the territory's mineral wealth. As well, the mountain lions represented just one obstacle in a larger campaign to consolidate power and resources under his influence. "There's more," Jake said, producing a final sheet of paper that made Sam's blood run cold. "Found this stuck to a tree near the old mining camp where the cats were originally living. Someone's been watching that area for months, documenting every detail about the lions' behavior and territory. The surveillance report was written in Murphy's distinctive handwriting, detailing the mountain lion's daily routines, hunting patterns, and den locations with military precision. It read like intelligence gathered for a military operation rather than routine predator control, including notations about optimal times for capture and methods for driving the animals toward populated areas. "They've been planning this for half a year," Sam said, his voice heavy with growing anger. "Everything that's happened, the attacks, the capture, the auction, it's all been orchestrated to clear the way for Hawthorne's mining operation." The revelation transformed Sam's understanding of his own role in these events. He'd been maneuvered as skillfully as the mountain lions themselves, positioned to solve Hawthorne's problem of disposing of dangerous animals without raising questions about their original purpose. The cattle baron had counted on someone like Sam stepping forward to purchase the cats, removing them from the territory permanently while appearing to act from noble motives. "He played me," Sam realized, his hands clenching into fists as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. "Counted on my soft heart to clean up his dirty work." But Jake's investigation had uncovered something Hawthorne hadn't anticipated: allies within the territorial government who were growing suspicious of his rapid expansion and questionable business practices. Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley wasn't the only law enforcement officer concerned about the concentration of power in Hawthorne's hands. "Marshal Davis in the territorial capital has been asking questions," Jake explained, producing a letter that bore official territorial seals. "Seems he's heard rumors about irregular mining claims and wants to investigate before approving Hawthorne's applications. Your purchase of those cats has given him the excuse he needed to delay the process." The letter detailed concerns about environmental impact, Native American treaty rights, and potential fraud in the surveying process that had identified mineral deposits in previously worthless territory. Marshal Davis was requesting a full investigation before allowing any mining operations to proceed, effectively freezing Hawthorne's plans until the situation could be properly examined. "That's why the pressure on you has been so intense," Jake continued. "Hawthorne needs those cats gone and forgotten before federal investigators start asking uncomfortable questions about what drove them from their original territory. As long as you're keeping them alive, they represent evidence of his manipulation." Sam stood and walked to his window, looking toward the barn where 3 mountain lions waited in cages that represented both imprisonment and salvation. Mary's journal, pressed against his chest, heavy with observations about the delicate relationships that sustained this harsh land. She'd understood that every creature served a purpose in the larger web of existence, that removing predators created imbalances that rippled through entire ecosystems. "What happens if I release them back to their original territory?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Hawthorne loses his mining claims," Jake replied simply. "Can't prove the land is safe for development if the predators that supposedly threatened it are right back where they started, especially if federal investigators are watching to see how this situation resolves." The choice before Sam had evolved from simple moral courage to active resistance against systematic corruption. Returning the mountain lions to their mountain home would expose Hawthorne's conspiracy while protecting wilderness that deserved preservation for its own sake. But such action would also declare war on the most powerful man in the territory, someone with resources and influence that could destroy lives as easily as swatting flies. "There's something else you should know," Jake said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Word is that Hawthorne's getting desperate. Some folks are saying he's hired additional men, outsiders who aren't particular about their methods. If you're planning to return those cats to the wild, you better understand that he'll do whatever it takes to stop you." Sam touched Mary's ring, feeling its familiar weight as he contemplated the path that lay ahead. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had revealed itself as something far more complex, a test of whether justice could prevail against corruption, whether one man's conviction could stand against systematic manipulation of law and power. Mountain lions in his barn weren't just captured animals awaiting freedom. They were living evidence of a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of territorial law, symbols of a struggle between those who viewed the land as something to be protected and those who saw it merely as a resource to be exploited. As evening shadows lengthened across his ranch, Sam understood that his decision about the mountain lion's fate would determine more than just their survival. It would define what kind of man he was, what kind of legacy he would leave, and whether the principles Mary had died believing in could survive in a world increasingly dominated by greed and manipulation. The revelation of Hawthorne's conspiracy transformed Sam's mission from personal redemption to a fight for the very soul of the territory. That evening, as he prepared the mountain lion's medicine, he could feel the weight of history pressing against his shoulders. This was no longer about saving 3 animals. It was about determining whether men like Hawthorne could manipulate law and nature for personal profit without facing consequences. Sam's father had carried similar weight during the war, making choices that affected more than just his own survival. The old cavalry revolver still hung in its place of honor above the fireplace, wrapped in oiled leather with the care befitting a sacred relic. Samuel Garrett Sr. had carried that Colt through 3 years of fighting, using it to defend principles he'd considered worth dying for. The weapon hadn't been fired in 20 years, not since Sam had used it to put down a rabid wolf that threatened his cattle. But tonight, he cleaned and loaded it with the methodical care his father had taught him, understanding that some situations required men to stand ready for whatever consequences their convictions might demand. A gun isn't a solution, his father had explained during one of their few conversations about the war. It's just a tool that lets honest men sleep peacefully because dishonest men know there are limits to what decent folks will tolerate. The mountain lions watched Sam's preparations with increasing alertness, sensing changes in their captor's behavior that suggested significant events approaching. The mother cat's wound was healing well under Mary's herbal treatments, her strength returning enough to pace restlessly within the confines of her cage. Her cubs had grown more responsive to Sam's presence, though they maintained the wariness that would serve them well in the wild. Doc Harrison arrived near midnight, carrying a medical bag and news that both encouraged and worried Sam. The veterinarian's expression carried the weight of a man who'd been forced to choose sides in a conflict he'd hoped to avoid. "Got word through Tom Bradley that you're planning to return those cats to their original territory," Doc said, without preamble. "Came to offer what help I can, though I need you to understand what that means for both of us." Sam poured coffee, while Doc examined the mother cat's healing shoulder, noting the improvement that Mary's remedies had produced. The big cat submitted to the examination with tolerance that spoke to growing trust, though her golden eyes never left Sam's face. During the process, "She's healing better than I expected," Doc admitted, applying fresh bandages with professional efficiency. "Whatever you're doing with those herbs is working. She'll be strong enough for travel within a few days, assuming travel is what you have in mind." The careful phrasing revealed Doc's awareness that discussing Sam's plans carried risks for everyone involved. Hawthorne's influence extended into every corner of the community's professional life, making open support for Sam's mission a proposition for anyone dependent on local business. "Appreciate your help," Sam replied, understanding the courage it took for Doc to offer assistance. "But I need you to know this might get dangerous. Hawthorne's not going to let those cats return to their territory without a fight." Doc's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile, revealing a core of steel beneath his gentle demeanor. "Been treating animals in this territory for 30 years, seen what happens when men like Hawthorne decide they own everything. That walks, crawls, or flies. Figure it's time someone stood up to that kind of thinking." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, moving with the stealth of men who didn't want their presence widely known. Sam's hand moved instinctively toward his father's revolver before Tom Bradley's. Voice called softly from the darkness. "Sam, it's Tom. Got some folks with me who want to talk." The group that emerged from the shadows included faces Sam recognized and others he didn't, united by expressions of grim determination. Tom Bradley led them, his deputy's badge catching moonlight as he approached the barn where the mountain lions waited. Behind him came John Morrison, Helen Morrison, and their eldest son Peter, neighbors who'd always maintained friendly relations despite differing views on predator management. But the surprise was the presence of 3 territorial rangers, federal officers, whose authority superseded local law enforcement. Their leader, a weathered man named Captain Wheeler, carried himself with military bearing that reminded Sam of his cavalry days. "Mr. Garrett," Captain Wheeler said, extending his hand with formal courtesy, "Marshal Davis sent us to investigate irregularities in recent mining claims. Your situation with these mountain lions has become part of a larger federal inquiry." The implications struck Sam like lightning. His act of compassion had attracted attention from territorial authorities who were already suspicious of Hawthorne's rapid expansion. The mountain lions represented more than rescued animals. They were living evidence in a federal investigation that could expose corruption throughout the territorial government. "We understand you're planning to return these animals to their original habitat," Wheeler continued, his voice carrying official authority. "Marshal Davis wants to observe that process personally, to document where these cats actually belong and verify claims about their threat to local livestock." John Morrison stepped forward, his farmer's hands twisting his hat brim with nervous energy. "Sam, Helen and I talked this over with our kids. What you're doing is right, even if it's dangerous. We want to help however we can." The offer of support from his neighbors carried emotional weight that nearly overwhelmed Sam's carefully maintained composure. These were people with their own families and livelihoods to protect, yet they were willing to risk Hawthorne's wrath for principles that transcended personal safety. "Bill Hawthorne's been pressuring everyone in the county to abandon you," Helen Morrison added, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had made her an effective teacher and community leader. "But some of us remember what this territory was, like before men like him decided they owned everything in it." Young Peter Morrison spoke up with the idealism of youth not yet tempered by practical concerns. "My ma taught me that doing right sometimes costs more than doing wrong. Figure this is one of those times." Captain Wheeler spread a territorial map across a wooden crate, marking locations that aligned with Jake's grandfather's ancient drawings. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud in mining claims throughout the region, with Hawthorne's applications showing suspicious patterns that suggested inside knowledge of mineral deposits. "Your cats originally lived here," Wheeler said, indicating a cluster of canyons deep in the wilderness, territory that Hawthorne claims is uninhabitable due to predator threats. "If you can return them successfully to that area, it undermines his entire application for mineral rights." The plan that emerged from their midnight conference was ambitious and dangerous, requiring precise timing and considerable courage from everyone involved. The mountain lions would be transported back to their original territory under federal observation, providing evidence that their presence there was natural rather than artificially created. But Hawthorne wasn't going to allow such a journey to proceed without opposition. Captain Wheeler's intelligence suggested that the cattle baron had hired additional men specifically to prevent the cat's return, understanding that their successful reintroduction would destroy his mining ambitions. "He's got Murphy and at least 6 others positioned along the main routes to the high country," Wheeler explained, marking potential ambush points on the map. "They're armed and desperate, with orders to stop you by any means necessary." Sam studied the map while considering alternatives that might avoid direct confrontation. His knowledge of the territory suggested possible routes that would bypass Hawthorne's anticipated positions, though such paths would require traveling through terrain that challenged even experienced mountain men. "There's an old Indian trail that follows Willow Creek up into the canyons," Sam said, tracing a faint line that appeared on few official maps. Narrow and dangerous, but it leads directly to where these cats belong. Hawthorne's men wouldn't expect us to attempt such a difficult route. Doc Harrison leaned over the map, studying the proposed path with professional concern. That trail crosses some of the roughest country in the territory. Moving 3 caged animals over that terrain would be extremely dangerous, especially for the injured female. More dangerous than facing Hawthorne's men in open country, Tom Bradley observed, his law enforcement experience providing tactical perspective. At least on the mountain trail, we'd have cover and defensive positions if things go wrong. The preparations continued through the night, as each member of the group accepted specific responsibilities for the mission ahead. The Morrisons would provide additional supplies and serve as communication links with other sympathetic ranchers. Doc Harrison would accompany the expedition to monitor the cat's health during the difficult journey. Captain Wheeler and his rangers would document the return process while providing federal authority to legitimize the operation. As dawn approached, Sam found himself standing beside the mother cat's cage, watching her magnificent golden eyes reflect the early light. Mary's herbal treatments had restored much of her strength, though the shoulder wound remained tender. Her cubs showed similar recovery, their natural vitality returning as stress decreased and proper nutrition restored their health. "Easy, girl," Sam murmured, using the gentle voice that had become familiar to all 3 cats. "This is the hard part, but we're going home. Back to the mountains where you belong." The great cat studied him with intelligence that seemed almost human, as if she understood that this strange human's intentions differed from those of her captors. Her cubs responded to Sam's voice by approaching the front of their cages, displaying curiosity rather than fear for the first time since their capture. Loading the cats for transport required careful coordination between multiple people, each movement planned to minimize stress while maintaining safety. The cages were secured to a specially reinforced wagon that could handle mountain terrain, equipped with provisions for a journey that might take several days, depending on weather and opposition. Sam's father's revolver rode in its holster, a weight both familiar and ominous against his hip. He hoped the weapon would remain unused, but Hawthorne's desperation made violence increasingly likely. The cattle baron had invested too much in his conspiracy to allow it to collapse without a fight. As the sun cleared the eastern mountains, painting the high country in shades of gold and crimson, Sam's makeshift expedition prepared to depart for territory that would test every skill and conviction they possessed. The mountain lions waited in their cages, unaware that their journey represented more than simple relocation. It was a test of whether justice could prevail against corruption in a land where strength too often trumped righteousness. The weight of Mary's wedding ring on Sam's finger reminded him that some commitments transcended personal safety, that love sometimes demanded sacrifice that defied rational calculation. Whether he possessed the courage to complete this mission remained to be seen, but the golden eyes watching him from iron cages deserved his best effort to restore the freedom that had been stolen from them. The Freedom Trail began where civilization ended, a narrow path carved by countless generations of deer, elk, and the native peoples who'd understood that some places demanded respect rather than conquest. Sam guided his wagon onto the ancient track as morning mist clung to the pines, each step carrying his precious cargo further from the corruption of human ambition toward the honest challenges of wilderness survival. The mountain lions sensed the change immediately, their alert postures and quickened breathing reflecting recognition of familiar scents and sounds. The mother cat's golden eyes tracked every sight and sound with intensity that spoke to memories of freedom, while her cubs pressed against the front bars of their cages as if trying to reach the wild country that called to their blood. Behind Sam's wagon, the support team spread out in protective formation. Captain Wheeler's Rangers maintained military precision, their eyes constantly scanning for signs of ambush, while Doc Harrison monitored the cat's condition during the difficult ascent. Tom Bradley and the Morrison family brought up the rear, ready to defend the expedition against whatever opposition Hawthorne might deploy. The trail itself tested every skill Sam had developed during decades of mountain travel. Designed for creatures that moved on foot rather than wheels, it demanded constant navigation around boulders, fallen trees, and stream crossings that challenged both human ingenuity and animal endurance. The reinforced wagon groaned under the strain of carrying 3 adult mountain lions over terrain never intended for such transport. 2 hours into the journey, as they climbed above the tree line where cover became sparse, Jake Collins materialized from the rocks ahead like a ghost. Materializing from morning shadows, his expression carried urgency that made Sam's blood run cold before the trapper spoke a single word. "Hawthorne's men are moving faster than expected," Jake reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "Murphy's got 8 riders positioned at Deadfall Pass, the only other route to the high country. They figured you'd avoid the main trail and try to circle around through easier terrain." Sam studied the landscape ahead, calculating distances and possibilities while time worked against his mission. Deadfall Pass offered the safest route for the wagon, but walking into a prepared ambush would doom both the cats and their rescuers. The Freedom Trail continued upward through increasingly treacherous terrain, requiring choices between speed and safety that could determine whether this rescue succeeded or became a tragedy. "How long before they realize we took this route?" Captain Wheeler asked, his military experience evaluating tactical options with professional precision. "Not long," Jake replied grimly. "They've got scouts watching all the approaches. Once they figure out where we've gone, they'll come after us with everything they have." The decision crystallized in Sam's mind with the clarity that had sustained him through previous crises. Forward meant accepting greater risks, but maintaining initiative, while retreat meant abandoning the mountain lions to captivity or death. Mary's voice seemed to whisper in the mountain wind, reminding him that some choices defined a man's entire character. "We keep going," Sam announced, his voice carrying finality that ended discussion. "These cats have waited long enough for freedom. They're not going back to cages because we're afraid of a fight." The wagon lurched forward as Sam urged his horses up the steepest section of trail yet encountered, wheels finding purchase on stone and gravel while gravity fought every inch of progress. The mountain lions endured the ordeal with stoic dignity, though the mother cat's labored breathing revealed the stress that rough travel imposed on her healing shoulder. Behind them, the sound of approaching horses carried on the thin mountain air, distant but growing closer with each passing minute. Hawthorne's men had discovered their route and were pushing hard to intercept the expedition before it could reach the sanctuary of the high peaks. "They're coming," Tom Bradley called from his rear guard position, his lawman's instincts recognizing the rhythm of pursuit in the echoing hoofbeats. 8 riders, maybe more, moving fast despite the difficult terrain. Sam's father's revolver seemed to grow heavier on his hip as the reality of armed confrontation approached. He'd hoped to complete this mission without violence, but Hawthorne's desperation made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. The cattle baron had invested too much in his conspiracy to allow it to collapse without exhausting every option. The trail ahead curved around a massive boulder that offered the first real defensive position they'd encountered since leaving the valley floor. Sam guided his wagon behind the stone shelter while his companions took positions that provided both protection and fields of fire if shooting became necessary. "This is as far as we go easy," Captain Wheeler observed, studying the approaches with tactical expertise. "From here, it's either stand and fight or try to outrun them to the canyon rim." The mountain lions waited in their cages, unaware that their fate hung in the balance of the confrontation approaching like storm clouds over the peaks. Their golden eyes reflected trust in this strange human who treated them with kindness, though they had no understanding of the forces arrayed against their return to freedom. Sam touched Mary's ring one final time, drawing strength from her. Memory as he prepared to face whatever consequences his convictions might demand. The Freedom Trail stretched ahead toward the wild country where these magnificent creatures belonged. But the path to that sanctuary led through a gauntlet of men who viewed principles as obstacles to profit. Behind them, the sound of pursuing. Horses grew louder, closer, more threatening with each echoing hoofbeat. Soon, very soon, Sam would learn whether one man's courage could stand against systematic corruption, whether love for wild things could triumph over human greed, whether the Freedom Trail would lead to salvation or become the site of their final. "Stand!" Murphy's voice echoed off the canyon walls like thunder before lightning, carrying authority backed by superior numbers and deadly intent. "Garrett, you've got nowhere left to run. Send those cats back down the mountain and nobody has to get hurt." Sam's position behind the massive boulder offered protection, but little comfort as he surveyed the tactical situation. Hawthorne's men had spread across the canyon mouth like a net designed to prevent escape, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sunlight. 8 against 6 seemed manageable until Sam counted the weapons and calculated the experience gap between his academic supporters and Murphy's hardened professionals. "What's it going to be, old man?" Murphy called again, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating opposition into submission. "You really want to die for 3 damned cats?" The mountain lions pressed against their cage bars, sensing the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. The mother cat's golden eyes met Sam's gaze through the iron slats, and for one impossible moment he felt as if she understood exactly what was at stake in the confrontation unfolding around her prison. Captain Wheeler crouched beside Sam, his federal authority providing legal weight but limited tactical advantage in terrain that favored Murphy's position. "I can order them to stand down," Wheeler offered, though his expression suggested little confidence in such a command's effectiveness. "Won't work," Tom Bradley observed from his position covering their right flank. "Murphy's not taking orders from anyone except Hawthorne, and he's got too much invested to back down now." The deadlock stretched taut as bowstring while both sides calculated odds and alternatives. Sam understood that any violence would likely doom the mountain lions, regardless of its outcome. Wounded or dead rescuers couldn't complete the journey to freedom, while Murphy's success would mean cages and circuses for creatures that deserved dignity. The solution came from an unexpected source as Jake Collins materialized above Murphy's position like a mountain spirit conjured from stone and shadow. The trapper's knowledge of terrain had allowed him to circle behind Hawthorne's men, positioning himself where his rifle could command their entire formation. "Murphy," Jake's voice carried down from the rimrock with calm authority. "You boys are trespassing on federal land during an official investigation. Suggest you reconsider your position before this gets more complicated than necessary." The balance shifted dramatically as Murphy's men realized they were caught between two forces in terrain that offered limited escape routes. Professional gunmen understood tactical disadvantage when it stared them in the face, and their leader's bravado faltered as the situation's reality became clear. But Hawthorne's foreman possessed the desperate courage of a man whose failure meant economic ruin and possible imprisonment. His rifle swung toward Jake's position with smooth precision, finger tightening on the trigger as he chose violence over surrender. Sam's father's revolver appeared in his hand without conscious thought, muscle memory from decades of mountain living responding to threat with practiced efficiency. The Colt barked once, its report echoing off canyon walls as Murphy's rifle flew from nerveless fingers to clatter among the rocks. "Next man who moves toward a weapon dies," Sam announced, his voice carrying quiet authority that froze Hawthorne's. Men in place. "This ends here, gentlemen. These cats are going home." The psychological victory proved as decisive as any military triumph. Faced with superior position, federal authority and a determination they hadn't anticipated, Murphy's men chose survival over loyalty to their employer, weapons lowered slowly, hands raised in gestures of surrender that acknowledged their defeat. "You're making a mistake, Garrett," Murphy snarled, cradling his wounded hand against his chest. "Hawthorne's not going to forget this. You've made an enemy who can destroy everything you've built." "Already done that myself," Sam replied, moving toward the mountain lion's cages with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. "Now let's finish what we came here to do." The canyon opened before them like a gateway to paradise, revealing the high country where the mountain lions had been born free. Ancient pines crowned ridges that stretched toward distant peaks, while meadows carpeted with wildflowers offered hunting grounds that could sustain generations of predators. Sam's hands trembled as he worked the cage latches, understanding that this moment represented more than simple liberation. It was a victory. For everything Mary had believed about dignity, courage, and the responsibility to protect what couldn't protect itself. The iron bars that had symbolized human dominance over nature swung open to reveal freedom that no amount of money could purchase. The mother cat emerged first, her magnificent form flowing from captivity to liberty with liquid grace that took Sam's breath away. She paused at the cage mouth, golden eyes meeting his with what seemed like gratitude before instinct called her toward the wild country where she belonged. Her cubs followed with the explosive energy of youth finally unleashed, bounding toward their mother with joy that transcended species barriers. Together, the reunited family approached the canyon rim where their territory spread before them like a promised land. The alpha's roar began deep in her chest, building to a sound that echoed off every cliff and pinnacle in the vast wilderness. It was a declaration of freedom, a challenge to any who would dare threaten her domain, a promise that the mountains would once again know the presence of their rightful queens. The magnificent sound rolled across the high country like thunder, carrying for miles to reach ears that had forgotten what true wildness sounded like. Sam felt the roar resonate in his bones, his heart, his soul, a reminder that some things remained beyond human corruption and control. As the three mountain lions disappeared into the wilderness that had always been their home, Sam understood that he'd witnessed something far greater than the rescue of endangered animals. He'd participated in the triumph of principle over profit, courage over convenience, love over indifference. The Freedom Trail had delivered its promise. 3 months after the mountain lion's roar echoed across the high country, Sam Garrett stood at his kitchen window watching autumn paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The familiar weight of Mary's ring on his finger carried new meaning now, representing not just memory, but the continuation of principles she'd died believing in. The simple gold band had witnessed the transformation of a quiet rancher into something he'd never expected to become, a defender of the wild places that made life worth living. The territorial investigation had concluded with results that exceeded even Captain Wheeler's expectations. Hawthorne's mining claims were rejected entirely, not just for fraudulent documentation, but for violation of federal wilderness protection laws that his own corruption had helped establish. The cattle baron's empire, built on manipulation and intimidation, collapsed with the spectacular finality of a house built on sand. Murphy and his men had disappeared into the territories like smoke on the wind, their employer's downfall eliminating both their employment and their protection from federal prosecution. Hawthorne himself faced charges that would likely see him imprisoned for years, his vast holdings liquidated to pay fines and compensation to those he'd wronged during his reign of greed. The transformation in Cedar Ridge proved even more dramatic than the legal consequences. Sam's return from the mountains had been met with a mixture of awe and embarrassment, as neighbors realized they'd witnessed genuine heroism rather than the madness they'd initially assumed. The social ostracism that had threatened to destroy his life evaporated overnight, replaced by respect that felt both gratifying and slightly uncomfortable. Funny how quickly folks change their tune when they realize they picked the wrong side. Tom Bradley observed during one of his regular coffee visits. The deputy marshal wore the silver star of a full sheriff now, promoted in recognition of his role in exposing territorial corruption. Half the town's claiming they supported you. All along, Sam chuckled at the familiar human tendency to rewrite history in more flattering terms. He bore no grudges against neighbors who'd responded to social pressure rather than principle. Courage was rare enough without condemning those who'd simply chosen safety over controversy. The economic consequences of Sam's heroism proved as positive as the social ones. With Hawthorne's monopolistic practices eliminated, local ranchers found themselves free to pursue more sustainable methods of predator management. Sam's approach of coexistence rather than warfare gained acceptance as other ranchers discovered that healthy ecosystems actually protected livestock more effectively than constant conflict. Doc Harrison had documented the mountain lions' successful reintegration into their original territory, photographing evidence that the great cats were not only surviving but thriving in their ancestral home. The photographs showed the mother cat, now fully healed, teaching her cubs to hunt in terrain that challenged even experienced predators. Their presence had restored natural balance to the high country, controlling rodent populations and preventing the overgrazing that had threatened several watersheds. Most satisfying of all were the reports from Jake Collins, who'd taken to visiting the remote canyons where the lions now roamed free. The trapper described seeing the family group expanded by new cubs, evidence that the cycle of life was resuming its natural rhythm after the disruption of human interference. "They remember you, Sam," Jake had reported during his last visit. "The mother cat watches me when I'm in her territory, but she doesn't run. Acts like she knows I'm connected to the man who gave her freedom." On this particular autumn morning, Sam was preparing for a journey that would complete the circle of his transformation. He'd fashioned a simple wooden marker from oak, taken from his own land, carved with words that captured the essence of what had transpired in these mountains. Here, 3 mountain lions returned to freedom through the courage of those who believe wild things deserve dignity. May this place remind future generations that some victories are measured not in profit, but in principle. The marker would be placed at the spot where the cats had emerged from their cages, creating a monument to the idea that individuals could still make a difference when institutions failed. It wasn't a grand gesture, but Sam had learned that the most important victories often happened quietly, witnessed only by golden eyes and autumn wind. The trail to the high country felt different, now transformed from a path of desperate necessity to one of peaceful pilgrimage. Sam rode alone this time, carrying only the marker and memories of the day when ordinary people had chosen extraordinary courage. The Freedom Trail had become sacred ground, sanctified by sacrifice and redeemed by success. As he approached the canyon where the mountain lions had regained their liberty, Sam felt Mary's presence more strongly than at any time since her death. She would have loved this ending, would have celebrated the triumph of compassion over cruelty with tears of joy that matched those now blurring his vision. The marker went into the ground easily, the rich mountain soil accepting this tribute. To wildness, like a blessing long overdue, Sam stood back to admire his work, noting how the simple wooden post seemed to belong in this landscape of stone and sky, timber and rushing water. A sound from the ridge above made him look up, and his heart nearly stopped at the sight that greeted him. The mother mountain lion stood silhouetted against the autumn sky, her magnificent form outlined in gold by the afternoon sun. She watched him for a long moment, those remarkable amber eyes reflecting intelligence and what Sam chose to interpret as gratitude. Then she was gone, vanishing into the wilderness with the fluid grace that marked her as queen of these mountains. But her presence had provided the perfect benediction for this moment, a reminder that some bonds transcended species and some gifts deserved no acknowledgement beyond the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. As Sam began his journey back to the valley and the life he'd rebuilt from the ashes of his sacrifice, he understood that Mary's legacy lived on in more than memory. It survived in every wild creature that would roam these mountains freely, in every person who chose courage over convenience, in every stand against those who viewed the natural world as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. The trail marker would weather seasons and storms, its simple message enduring long after those who'd placed it were forgotten. But the principle it represented, that love sometimes demanded sacrifice, that defied rational calculation, would outlive any monument, carried forward by hearts that remembered the day when 3 mountain lions taught an entire territory the meaning of true freedom. Behind him, the high country settled into the peaceful silence that marked its eternal rhythms. Guardianship now restored to those born to protect it. Ahead lay home, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd discovered that the measure of a life well lived could never be calculated in dollars and cents.